Shalom everybody, Akiva Gersh here from Vegan Rabbi Shavuot Tov. Hope you're doing well. I wanted to look at the two texts that we looked at last time and just go a little bit deeper. Trying to keep the videos a bit on the short side so we don't always have time to go into all the different levels. So I want to use this video to go just another step or two forward with what we're learning before. I want to remind you, if you saw the previous video, they were talking a couple of parshiot ago, a couple of Torah portions ago, in Parshat Re'eh, where it talks about Hashem in the future, meaning the future after Bnei Yisrael would leave the Midbar and they come into the land of Israel, and after conquering the land, after those 14 years, then their borders, their boundaries would be expanded. And there was an idea that one can only eat meat. A person could only eat meat if they brought the animal as a sacrifice to the Mishkan, right, into this holy, sacred space, brought some of the animal onto the altar, and then that person was allowed to partake of the meat of the animal as well for themselves personally. Right? But first they needed to bring the animal again into this like magical and mystical, very, very powerful space to create this connection with this animal, right? That this animal was being slaughtered in front of them. This animal was being slaughtered for them. It was very clear, it was very obvious what was going on here. It was right in front of them. And in addition, the holy space that surrounded this whole experience. So that's like a very specific type of eating meat that was allowed. And then Hashem says in the Torah, says, but you know what, once you go into Eretz Yisrael, not everyone's going to live so close to where the Mishkan is going to be. It's going to be very, very far from most people. So you know what, I'm going to let you also eat meat, even once the boundaries are expanded. But it's interesting, going back to the verse that we shared last time, it says, Ki yarchiv Hashem Elokecha et gvulcha, kasher debelach, right? That when Hashem expands the boundaries, v'amarta ochla basar, and you will say, I will eat meat, ki te'aveh nafshecha lechol basar. This lashon, this language of te'aveh, I think it's very interesting that the Torah uses this word te'aveh to speak about this desire to eat meat, because it's not just like ratzon, it's not just like ani rotzeh or ani tzarich, like I want or I need. It's te'aveh. It's a very specific word that talks about this like ta'ava, this desire. And usually in general in Judaism, ta'avot are not looked upon very positively. It's usually looked at something as something that we should overcome. Recognize I have a ta'ava for something. I have like a desire. Sometimes it's even translated as lust, right? And I have this desire, and I should work on myself to not give into it, to not be, overwhelmed by it, but to overcome it. So I think that's the first extra point I wanted to bring up, and I think it's very interesting that within the pasuk that's talking about eating meat, and the permission to eat meat in a context that was not in the Mishkan, that was not in this very specific sacred and holy space, but in our everyday lives, that recognizing that if you want meat in that space, if you want to eat meat in that kind of space, recognize where it's coming from, right? Recognize where your desire is coming from, and maybe if you go deep enough and you recognize, maybe you're going to stop yourself, and maybe you're not going to actually come to the stage of actually eating the meat. And that's what we said last time. The Baal HaTurim was saying, right, that why is this pasuk, which talks about eating meat, right next to the next one, which says ki yirchak mimcha, that it'll be far from you. And that's talking about Jerusalem being far from you, where the Mishkan is going to be, where the temple is going to be, right? You won't have the time, to walk your animal all the way over there in order to eat it. And so the Torah is saying on some level, yes, the permission will be granted, but it's also kind of giving a little bit of a warning, recognize where that desire is coming from. And the Baal HaTurim really picks up on that. He says, why are these two pasukim next to each other? To teach us, right, that a person should really distance him or herself from eating meat at all. So that's the first kind of fine-tuning of that one point. And then going back into the Gemara like we did last time in Chulin, just wanted to kind of sharpen one other point. We said it, but just to sharpen it a little bit more, where it says in Chulin on page 84, the first side, Pei Dalet Amud Aleph, says that Lamdat Torah Derech Eretz, right? That the Torah is teaching derech eretz. Shelo yochol adam basar el te'avon. Yechol yikach adam min hashuk. Right. So the Torah or the Gemara is saying here, when the Torah teaches that someone should only be eating meat in this certain way if they have this te'avon, this really deep desire, in conjunction with what we just learned from the Baal HaTurim, that maybe they're just not succeeding in overcoming, that they just didn't, succeed so much 100% in dealing with, and they are going to eat it. The next step that the Gemara says is Yachol Yikach Adam Min HaShuk. You might think now that that person has permission to eat meat in this kind of way, that they can just go to the shuk, to the market, to the store, and just pick up a piece of meat and go home and cook it. No, the Gemara says, right? No, it says, hold on one second, Yachol Yikach Adam Min HaShuk, Yachol Tamid Lomar, right? And it quotes a pasuk that says, right, and you shall bring as a sacrifice, you shall raise up as a sacrifice from your cattle and from your herd, right, from your own animals. And that's what we said last time when Rashi says, Im yeshlo, right, if you have in your herd, sababa, yikach, then you can take. V'im lav, lo yikne bashuk, right, then don't buy in the market. And it's a very powerful idea. Again, just to fine tune it, the Gemara here, along with Rashi, is telling us, is teaching us that if you have the animals in your cattle, in your herd, meaning you've raised them, you've taken care of them, you've been with them like day in, day out for like months, if not years, you've developed a relationship, you've taken care of them, right? And they're just part of your world and part of your life, and you see them every day. That's the kind of animal you can then take and walk to the shochet, to the slaughterer, and get slaughtered for you to eat meat, because you have this relationship, right? You know what the animal has been through. You know the living conditions. Okay, you were there, right? It's very much part of your life, and most likely you're going to feel like a real sense of pain and loss, having killed one of your animals, to satisfy your own eating desires. Right? And that way, the Gemara with Rashi is saying that's okay. But if not, if you don't have those animals, if you don't have cattle, if you don't have a flock, a herd of sheep, let's say, don't go to the store and buy some steak or some piece of meat that somebody else raised, that you weren't there for, that you weren't part of, that you didn't have a relationship to. That's not the way the Gemara, along with Rashi, is telling us we should be eating meat. Right, so put all those things together. Fast forward. This was like Rashi was 1,000 years ago. The Gemara was 1,500 years ago. Right, this was a different world where people did have more of those intimate and personal connections with animals. Right, today when we are so disconnected and there's such a great distance between us and all of our food, right, especially the food that comes from animals. And we look at this Gemara and we look at this Rashi, it makes us wonder, makes us question, right? Is the way that people are eating meat today the proper Jewish way of eating meat? Where they weren't part of the process of raising it, they never even saw the animal, they didn't even know where the animal was living, where the meat actually came from. All they see is the end product, the byproduct of that whole system, right? A piece of meat, as we said last time, with like plastic wrapped around it and a price tag slapped on it. That's all they see. And it seems to me that what the Gemara is saying here, along with Rashi, is saying that's not the way Judaism wants us to meet. And if that's the only thing available to you, better look for something else to sustain yourself. All the best, and be well.